When I first applied for the job at the Museum of Oddities, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The place had a reputation, of course. People whispered about it. They said it was haunted, that strange things happened after hours, and that the curator, Mr. Prescott, was a little eccentric. But I figured it was all just part of the museum's allure. After all, what museum didn't have a bit of mystery surrounding it? I needed the job. I had just moved to the city, desperate for anything that would pay the rent, and the museum was offering part-time hours with decent pay. And to be honest, I'd always been fascinated by strange and unusual artifacts. The idea of working with them seemed exciting, even if a little weird. The museum itself was tucked away on a quiet street, a 3-story building surrounded by ivy and ancient trees. The outside looked like something straight out of a Gothic novel: weathered stone, tall windows, and a large, heavy door that creaked whenever you opened it. Inside, the museum was just as peculiar. The walls were lined with glass cases, each housing objects that seemed to belong in another time: ancient relics, strange tools, and odd sculptures. Some of the displays had descriptions, but many of the artifacts were unlabeled, their origins and purposes left to mystery. Mr. Prescott, the curator, was an older man, thin and sharp-eyed, with an air of authority that made him seem untouchable. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words were cryptic and layered with more questions than answers. Most of the staff were equally strange, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. It was as though the museum had a way of shaping the people who worked there, molding them into something different. On my first day, Mr. Prescott handed me a set of keys to the museum, along with a list of rules. Some of them were standard. Don't touch the artifacts. Keep the displays clean. Do not let anyone wander after hours. But there was one rule, written at the bottom of the list, that stood out: do not stay after dark. The artifacts are not what they seem. I shrugged it off as some sort of odd joke, thinking it was just one of those quirky museum myths that people like to embellish. The rest of the staff seemed to ignore it too, going about their work as if the rule didn't even exist. I quickly fell into a routine, cleaning the exhibits during the day and assisting with tours. Everything seemed fine, even if the atmosphere of the place was a little unsettling. There was something about the way the artifacts seemed to watch you, something about how they never quite felt still. One night, however, everything changed. I had stayed late to finish up some paperwork, and as the clock ticked past closing time, I was the only one left in the building. The museum was eerily quiet. I couldn't hear the usual hum of activity from the outside world. It was as though I was trapped in some kind of time bubble, a place frozen in history. I was just about to leave when I heard it, a faint sound coming from the back of the museum, near the exhibit for ancient weapons. It was a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought it was the janitor or one of the other staff members, but then I remembered I was alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a sudden wave of unease wash over me. I decided to check it out, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls as I moved toward the back of the museum. The scraping grew louder, more frantic. I turned the corner, and that's when I saw it. The sword. The ancient ceremonial sword, which had been displayed in its case just hours ago, was now outside of it, lying on the floor. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. What made my heart stop was the fact that it was moving. The sword twitched, its blade scraping against the floor as though it had a life of its own. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step forward, But before I could move any closer, I heard a loud clang from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The museum had fallen completely silent again, except for the distant sound of the sword dragging along the floor. I backed away slowly, my legs feeling like lead, my mind racing to explain what I had just seen. But there was no logical explanation for it. The sword had been in its display case all day, untouched, and now it was moving on its own. That was the first night I learned the truth about the museum. It was alive. The artifacts weren't just objects, they were something more. And the moment the sun set, they came to life. The next morning, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that clung to me after the sword incident. I had barely slept, my mind running in circles, trying to rationalize what I had seen. There was no way the sword had just moved on its own, right? I must have imagined it. It was a long night, and maybe exhaustion had clouded my judgment. But as the day wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept looking at the sword display as I worked, half expecting to see it out of place again, but nothing happened. The museum was as quiet as ever, and the artifacts stood motionless in their glass cases. Everything was fine, or at least it appeared to be. It wasn't until the following night that things truly started to get strange. I stayed late again, finishing up some extra cleaning and doing inventory of the exhibits. The place was deserted, except for the soft hum of the lights above. As the clock neared closing time, I couldn't help but feel an odd tension in the air, as if the museum itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. That's when I heard it again, the faint scraping sound from the back of the museum. This time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't my imagination. My heart rate quickened, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Was it the sword again? Maybe another piece had shifted out of place, or maybe, just maybe, there was something else going on in the museum after hours. I grabbed a flashlight from the back office and slowly moved toward the source of the sound. As I walked down the hall, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, almost like they were reaching out to me. The walls seemed to close in with each step, and the temperature in the museum had dropped significantly. It felt like I was walking through some kind of fog, thick and suffocating. I reached the corner where the scraping noise seemed to be coming from, but as I turned, I froze. The door to the storage room was wide open. I was certain I had locked it when I had checked earlier, but now it stood ajar, as if inviting me inside. My hand trembled as I moved toward the door, the cold metal of the flashlight gripped tight in my fingers. I hesitated for a moment, listening for any sounds. The scraping had stopped, but there was still an eerie silence that surrounded me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as though the entire museum had gone still, as if it were waiting for something. I stepped inside the storage room, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing row after row of shelves filled with old boxes and storage crates. The light flickered slightly as I moved further into the room. Then I saw it. The artifacts were gone. I blinked. My eyes darted around the room, looking at the empty shelves. What was going on? There had been crates filled with old relics, pieces from different parts of the world, but now they were completely empty, as if they had never been there at all. I stumbled back, feeling a wave of panic wash over me. Had I imagined the crates? Had I been so tired that I'd confused the shelves for something else? But no, I couldn't have. I knew what I had seen. The crates had been filled with artifacts. Now they were gone. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a soft click, like something being placed on the floor. I turned quickly, and my flashlight beam landed on one of the large display cases. The glass was cracked, a thin spiderweb of cracks spreading across its surface. Inside, the objects were shifting, moving. The eerie scraping sound returned, louder now, as though the artifacts themselves were alive, rearranging in their case. I stepped forward cautiously, my mind racing to catch up with what I was seeing. There, on the shelf in front of me, was an old mask, carved from stone and worn with age. It had been part of an exhibit on ancient tribal rituals. I had seen it only hours ago, resting undisturbed in its case, but now its eyes seemed to follow me. I could feel them, staring. The mask's features twisted unnaturally as though it were alive, its carved mouth seeming to twitch into a grin. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a simple display of old relics. These things, they were moving. They were alive. Without thinking, I rushed toward the door, but when I tried to leave the storage room, it slammed shut in front of me. The sound echoed in the empty room like a slap. I grabbed the doorknob, shaking it, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room plummeted further, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The whispers began again. This time, they were louder, clearer, no longer just a faint murmur. They were all around me, pressing in, coming from every direction. Some of them were unintelligible, but one voice, sharp and cold, cut through the rest. "You've disturbed us." I spun around, my flashlight beam shaking wildly, searching for the source of the voice. But the room was still empty, the shelves still bare, except for the twisted artifacts staring back at me. Then, slowly, I saw them. The objects, everything in the room was moving toward me. The masks, the figurines, the broken statues. They were all shifting, scraping, dragging across the floor toward me. I backed away, panic flooding my veins. "What do you want?" I shouted, but my voice sounded weak in the face of the growing darkness. "What are you?" The whispering voices grew louder, rising into a cacophony of whispers. The objects were closing in, their forms shifting, as though they were alive, as though they were feeding on my fear. "You woke us up." The voice came again, stronger, colder. "Now you will stay with us. Forever." I turned to run, but the door wouldn't open. The walls seemed to close in, the room stretching out to contain me, to trap me. I was not just in the museum anymore. I was inside it, surrounded by the very artifacts that had come to life. They weren't just relics of the past anymore. They were alive, and they were taking me with them. The room felt like it was collapsing around me, the walls closing in as the artifacts moved toward me, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. I was trapped. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but the door wouldn't open. The walls seemed to shift and the air felt thick, like it was suffocating me. I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the shelves, trying to find an escape, but everything around me seemed to warp, twist, and shift as if the museum itself were alive with malice. The cold was unbearable now, my breath coming in visible puffs as I fought to stay calm. The objects, the artifacts, were getting closer. I could hear their scraping as they inched across the floor, the sound like nails on a chalkboard, dragging, groaning. My flashlight flickered, and for a second, I saw something shift out of the corner of my eye. The mask. It was staring at me, its eyes glowing, moving on its own as if it had a mind of its own. Suddenly, the whispers from the walls grew louder, and I could feel the temperature drop even further, the air pressing against my skin like a heavy weight. The artifacts had stopped moving, frozen in place, but the voices, the whispers, filled the space around me. "You have disturbed us," the voice hissed. "You have entered where you do not belong. Now you will pay the price." My head spun. The mask's eyes seemed to follow me as I turned, and in the dim light, I saw more artifacts moving slowly, inching toward me like they were drawn by some invisible force. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to move, but the world around me was moving too, shifting, and I wasn't sure which way was up anymore. I finally made a decision. I needed to get out. I had to break free. The door was locked, but I didn't care. I could hear the scraping of the artifacts coming closer, but I didn't care. I was going to make it. The door opened as I yanked on the handle, but it wasn't the door to the hallway. It was something else, something darker. The hallway that once seemed so familiar now looked like a shadowy, warped version of its former self. The walls were distorted, stretched, and the light from my flashlight barely cut through the gloom. The whispers were louder now, overwhelming. I rushed down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Every inch of the floor seemed to groan beneath me, like the very ground was alive and I couldn't escape. I could hear footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. Just more shadows, stretching, warping. I had to get to the front door. I had to get out of this place before it consumed me. But as I reached the front, I froze. The front door was wide open. I couldn't breathe. The air outside had been suffocating, heavy with the weight of the museum's secrets. But now I was faced with the open space outside, the freedom I longed for. But something stopped me. I looked behind me. The walls were closing in again, the shadows growing, crawling toward me. The museum wasn't just a building anymore. It had become part of me. The artifacts weren't just objects, they were alive, feeding off my fear, my confusion. And I could feel them watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I reached out toward the door, my hand trembling, but before I could make it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the force of it shaking the entire building. My heart stopped, and I spun around, my mind racing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't just some freak accident. It was the house, the museum, closing me in. I wasn't supposed to leave. The whispers had started again, but this time they were different. They were clearer, more urgent. "You are one of us now." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I stepped back from the door. I knew what it meant. The museum wasn't going to let me go. It wasn't just haunted. It was a prison. And I had stepped into it, walked into its trap willingly, thinking I could control it. But now, I was part of it. And the artifacts, they were not just objects, they were the key. The museum had chosen me. I was to become one of them. I turned back toward the hallway, but the path ahead seemed to disappear into the darkness. The only light came from the flickering of my flashlight, casting strange shadows on the walls. As I moved, I noticed something on the wall in front of me. It wasn't there before. A strange symbol, glowing faintly, carved into the stone. The edges seemed to pulse with life, and when I stepped closer, the air around me grew colder. The symbol was a warning. I could feel it. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was bad. Something dark, something that had been waiting for me. I reached for it, drawn in by the need to understand. But the moment my fingers touched the stone, a jolt of electricity shot through my body, and I collapsed backward. My head slammed against the floor, and for a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the main hall facing the mirror that hadn't been there before. and I saw it, the reflection of me. But it wasn't me. The figure staring back at me had hollow eyes, a twisted grin, and its hand was raised as if it were beckoning me. And then, I knew, the house wasn't just alive, it was controlling me, making me part of its collection. I struggled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest as I backed away from the mirror. The reflection wasn't just a distorted image anymore, it was a part of the house, alive, aware, and pulling me into its web. The twisted figure in the mirror reached out toward me, its hands stretching unnaturally long, as though it were trying to escape the glass, to pull me into its darkness. I froze, unable to move, as the air around me grew thick and suffocating. I could feel the temperature drop, a chill seeping into my bones, and I realized that the house wasn't just observing me, it was controlling me, pulling me deeper into its grasp with each passing moment. I turned away from the mirror, panic gripping me, and rushed toward the hallway again. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the shadows growing longer, thicker, as though they were swallowing up the space around me. The floor beneath my feet groaned with every step, and the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't understand. The house, I realized, wasn't just a building, it was alive. It had always been alive. It had wanted me here, and now I was part of it. The artifacts weren't just objects, they were prisoners, just like me, trapped in the endless cycle of the house's influence. They moved, they shifted, they lived, but only because the house allowed it. I tried to run, tried to find an escape, but I could feel the weight of the house pressing in on me, pulling at my mind, dragging me deeper into its darkness. The whispers grew louder again, voices indistinguishable from one another, overlapping and echoing in my ears. "You are one of us now." The words rang in my head, louder than any voice I'd heard before. It wasn't just the house that was speaking, it was the artifacts, the relics, the very objects that had once been displayed as mere curiosities. They were alive, they were awake, and they were waiting for me to join them. I stumbled through the hallway, my feet dragging as if the floor had become a part of me, a part of the house's dark pull. I could hear the tapping again, the soft scraping of something moving in the dark. It was coming from the back of the museum, from the storage room. I knew I shouldn't go back there. I had already seen what happened when you followed the pull, when you let your curiosity get the best of you. But something inside me urged me forward, something I couldn't explain, something that felt like a force beyond my control. I reached the storage room door, and before I could stop myself, I pushed it open. Inside, everything was just as it had been before, but there was an odd, unsettling stillness to the air. The shelves, the crates, the artifacts, they were all there, but something was wrong. The objects in their cases were now moving again, shifting slowly as if they were waking up from a long sleep. I saw the mask first, the one I had noticed earlier, the one that had grinned at me. It was now alive, twitching slightly as though it was trying to break free from its display. I stepped forward, my feet unwilling to obey, and as I did, the room seemed to warp around me. The shadows deepened, and the artifacts began to move faster, jerking and swaying, their forms warping in and out of focus. It was as if the objects were being brought to life by some unseen force, pulled toward me, drawn to my presence. I could hear their voices now, clearer than ever, their whispers filling the air around me. They weren't speaking in words, they were speaking in feelings, in urges. Join us. Become one with the house. The room seemed to shift again, the walls warping, bending as though the very structure of the museum was changing, expanding. I felt myself being pulled deeper, my mind losing its grip on reality. The air was thick, suffocating, and my chest tightened as though the house were squeezing the life out of me. I tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped, surrounded by the moving, living artifacts that now reached toward me with their twisted, gnarled limbs. The mask, the swords, the statues, they were all alive, all hungry, and I knew that they wanted me. I could feel the coldness of the stone as it pressed against my skin, the sharp edges of the metal cutting into my arms as I struggled. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, their voices overlapping until they were all I could hear. The world around me felt like it was spinning, warping, as though the house itself were pulling me into its center, swallowing me whole. The artifacts reached for me, their hands pulling at my clothes, my skin, as though they were trying to drag me into their cursed existence. You belong to us now. The words echoed in my mind as the shadows closed in, the artifacts moving faster, closing the gap between us. And as I was consumed by the darkness, I realized the truth. I wasn't just trapped in the museum. I was the museum. I was part of its collection, another relic among the forgotten pieces that would never leave, never be free. I had become one of them. I was suffocating. Every breath felt like I was inhaling a thick, oppressive fog that clung to my lungs, pressing down on my chest, suffocating my will. The walls of the room seemed to stretch out and then close in, like they were breathing with me, trapping me in their grasp. The once familiar space of the museum had warped into something else entirely. Something alive, something that had claimed me. The artifacts continued their relentless approach. The mask, now grinning widely, seemed to stretch impossibly wide as though it were about to devour me. The statues shifted, their limbs creaking and snapping as if they were coming to life, their stone eyes burning with an unnatural fire. The swords I had seen earlier hovered just out of reach, their blades gleaming like they were waiting to strike. The whispers surrounded me, voices rising and falling in a rhythmic, hypnotic pattern, all saying the same thing. Join us. I could feel them pulling at me, dragging me toward them. My feet wouldn't obey. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground, but I was slowly being dragged forward by an invisible force. The artifacts were no longer static displays in cases. They were alive in a way that made my skin crawl. You belong to us now. The voice that spoke was different from the others, sharp, commanding. It was coming from everywhere at once, as though the very museum was speaking to me. I couldn't look away from the scene unfolding around me. Every inch of my body screamed to break free, but the shadows had woven themselves into the fabric of my being. The air seemed to vibrate with the energy of the place, and the weight of its curse pressed against me. I turned my head toward the door, the only exit, and, to my horror, it was no longer there. The room had shifted again. The walls seemed to twist, bend, and distort in ways that made no sense. The path I had walked before was now gone, replaced by more shadows, more dark corners filled with writhing forms that I couldn't make out. It was like I was in a dream, a nightmare, and I couldn't wake up. And then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. The touch was ice cold, sending a shock of terror through my spine. I whirled around, but no one was there. Just the shadows, the shifting artifacts, and the overwhelming presence of the house, pressing in from all sides. The sensation of being watched intensified, and I realized that it wasn't just the artifacts that were alive. I was the one being watched. I was the one being evaluated. Do you understand now? The voice, deep and resonant, seemed to come from every corner of the room. "You are part of the collection. You always have been." I didn't understand. What did that mean? The whispering grew louder, and I could hear a new voice, faint but clear. "The collector will have you." The shadows seemed to pulse with life, undulating like waves crashing against an invisible shore. The room began to tilt, the walls bending at impossible angles, warping in ways that no normal structure could. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow but deliberate, echoing through the darkened halls, getting closer. And then I saw him. A figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall, clad in a dark suit, his face obscured by the shadows. The way he moved, smooth, deliberate, almost too fluid to be human, was enough to make my stomach churn. His eyes were black, empty voids, and as he stepped closer, I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing against me. "You've broken the rules," the collector said, his voice cold and hollow. "You've disturbed the collection, and now you'll be a part of it." His words rang in my head, and I understood now. The artifacts weren't just relics, they were souls, trapped in this museum, forever a part of the collector's twisted collection. And now, I was one of them. The collector reached out a hand, and I felt it. The pull. It was as if the entire room was drawing me in, like I was being sucked into a vortex. The artifacts, the masks, the swords, the statues, they weren't just moving toward me. They were growing closer, their forms becoming more solid, more dangerous. The air was thick with an energy that I couldn't describe, a dark force that seemed to have no end. I fought it. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs refused to move. My mind screamed, but no sound came out. The house had taken me. It had claimed me. The collector's hand was inches from my face now. "You will never leave. You will become a part of my collection." I tried to scream, to fight back, but the shadowy figures pressed against me, their cold, clammy hands wrapping around my arms, my legs, holding me still. The pressure was unbearable. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world around me was falling apart, becoming nothing but shadows and whispers. "We all belong to the collection now," the collector whispered, his voice like ice, "and you will never escape." As his hand touched my face, I felt a sharp, stabbing pain. It was as though my very soul was being pulled out of my body. My vision blurred, and I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. But there was no pain. It was an emptiness, a hollowing, as though the life inside me was being drained away. The last thing I saw was the reflection of the museum, the same place I had walked into, now filled with the dark figures of the collection. They were watching me, waiting, and then everything went black. I don't know how much time passed before I regained consciousness. My eyes opened, but there was only darkness. I could feel a coldness seeping through my skin, through my very bones. A numbness that wasn't just physical. It was as though I had become a part of the very air around me. Thin, transparent, empty. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, as if they no longer belonged to me. Every inch of my body felt foreign, unfamiliar, like I was trapped inside a shell, and it took all of my strength to even twitch a finger. And then, as my vision slowly returned, I realized I was no longer in the museum. I wasn't anywhere that I could recognize. It was dark, dark in a way that felt oppressive, as though the very air was thick with a weight that was suffocating. The walls around me were shrouded in shadow, and there was no light, no warmth. Everything felt cold, yet there was an odd hum in the distance, a low, rhythmic vibration, like a heartbeat echoing from far away. I tried to push myself up, but I couldn't feel the ground beneath me. It was as though I was floating. My thoughts were muddled, my mind a tangled web of confusion. What happened to me? Where was I? The last thing I remembered was the collector's hand, cold and sharp, touching my face. The pain, the hollow emptiness, it had felt like I was being ripped apart from the inside. I had to remember. I had to understand what had happened and why. I tried to focus, tried to look around, but I couldn't see anything. The shadows pressed in on me from all sides, and the suffocating stillness made it impossible to think clearly. Then, a voice broke through the silence. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, more defined, until it was all I could hear. It was not my voice. It was something else, something other, something darker. "You're here now." The words wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into the shadows. I couldn't tell where they came from. The voice didn't belong to anyone, yet it was everywhere. I felt it in my chest, in my throat, like a presence invading my thoughts. "You belong to the collection." I blinked, trying to focus. And that's when I saw them, the figures. They stood in the dark, just beyond my line of sight, but I could feel them. They were watching me. The same artifacts, the same faces, no longer just reflections. They were alive, and they were waiting. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I was choking on silence. The darkness pressed tighter around me, and I felt a pull deep within me, a compulsion to move toward them, to join them. But I fought it. I tried to resist. I had to resist. I forced myself to take a step, then another, my body aching with the effort. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, moving, as though it wasn't stable at all. But I kept moving forward despite the growing fear in my chest. "You cannot escape." The voice was back, stronger this time. I turned my head, scanning the space around me, but there was nothing there. Nothing tangible. Only the shadowy forms that hovered just beyond the edges of my vision, lurking, waiting. The pull grew stronger, more insistent, like something was calling me, something that wanted to consume me entirely. The closer I got to the figures, the more real they became. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were people, or things that had once been people. They were the souls trapped in the artifacts, the ones who had come before me. They were the collection, the ones who had been swallowed by the museum, bound to it for eternity. And now, I was one of them. "Join us," they whispered, their voices blending together in a chorus of longing. "Be part of the collection." I stumbled, my body feeling heavier with each step. The figures reached out, their hands cold and translucent, grasping at the air like they were trying to pull me into their embrace. And then I saw it, the mirror. It stood before me, towering and impossibly large, its surface reflecting nothing. It wasn't like the mirrors in the museum. It was darker, deeper, like it was a window into something else, something endless. I could feel it pulling me, pulling my very soul toward it. I stepped closer, almost without thinking. The mirror's surface shimmered like water disturbed by a stone. And then, there it was, my reflection. But it wasn't me, not anymore. My face stared back at me, but the eyes were hollow. The smile, twisted, grotesque. It was me, but it wasn't. I had become a part of the museum, a part of the collection. And now, the mirror was showing me what I had become. A soul trapped, forever staring back at myself, lost in an endless cycle. The figures, the artifacts, the voices, they were all part of this cursed place. And now, I was one of them. You belong to the museum now. The voice spoke again, and this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. You will never leave. I felt the cold, the darkness, the pull of the mirror wrapping around me, dragging me into its depths. I reached out, but my hand was already a reflection, an image, an artifact among the others. There was no escaping it. The museum had taken me, and now it would keep me forever.